I'll never forget that day in the courtroom. You could feel the weight of it the moment you stepped inside. Not from noise. No, it wasn't loud. In fact, that was the strangest part. It was too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you second guess. Breathing too loud. Like everyone knew something big was about to happen, but no one wanted to say it out loud. Diddy was already seated at the defense table. Sharp suit, well-groomed, every inch of him trying to look composed. But if you watched closely, and I mean really watched, you'd see it. The smallest things. His right leg kept shifting, that nervous kind of movement that doesn't stop once it starts. It shook slightly under the table. Not enough to rattle, just enough to show he wasn't fully in control of it. His jaw was tight, clenched, like he was chewing back frustration or fear. Every time the prosecution so much as mentioned the photo or the burnt documents, or even just the word trash, he'd look away, wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Almost like the courtroom lights had gotten too bright all of a sudden. One of his defense attorneys, can't remember which one, maybe the younger one, leaned in to whisper something. Probably advice, reassurance, maybe a warning. But Diddy waved him off. Subtle. Just a flick of his hand. That's when I noticed the tremble. His hand wasn't steady. Just a faint shake, like adrenaline with nowhere to go. Then, as the prosecutor stood and reached for a stack of evidence folders, you could see the shift in the room. Like we all collectively leaned forward, without meaning to. Everyone knew the maid's deposition was coming. Most folks thought it'd be small. Background noise, really? But in that silence, stuffed so tight it felt like cotton in your ears, there was something else. A kind of nervous anticipation. We didn't know it yet, not fully, but something was about to change. And Diddy? He may have tried to sit still, to keep the mask on, but that mask was already starting to slip. The moment she walked in, you could tell this wasn't going to be some forgettable testimony. She wasn't loud. She didn't storm in or demand attention. No, she walked in quietly, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped in front of her, wearing a plain dark dress that almost blended into the wood-paneled walls. But what made everyone sit up straighter was the look in her eyes. Tired? Yes. Nervous? Definitely. But also steady. Like someone who had carried something heavy for too long and had finally decided to put it down. The bailiff swore her in, and she adjusted the mic like she'd never used one before. And then she started speaking. Her voice? Softer than I expected. With a hint of an accent, maybe Caribbean or Southern. It was hard to place. But every word was clear. Careful. Like she'd been rehearsing this not just for court, but in her head, night after night, for years. She told us about the house first, how beautiful it was. The parties, the staff, the rules. She explained how her job was to clean the East Wing and handle trash collection from specific areas, mostly the upstairs rooms and the private den. She said she never asked questions, never needed to. That was the unspoken rule. You see something, you clean it up, and you keep your mouth shut. But over time, she said, things started to change. She described moments that made the whole room lean in. How Diddy's behavior became more tense. How he'd stop talking mid-sentence when certain people walked in the room. How the music at the house parties would suddenly cut out. And how security would rush to close off certain parts of the mansion. She said she always kept her head down. But she noticed everything. Then came the part that made Diddy shift again. More obvious this time. The maid described something small. Just one day. A quiet afternoon. Maybe a Monday. She'd gone to empty the trash in the upstairs den, like she always did. But this time, the trash smelled different. Not just paper or food. It smelled like burnt plastic and chemicals. Something that didn't belong. And when she opened the bin, she saw the edges of a manila folder sticking out. Singed around the corners. She said she never read people's trash. That was her boundary. But something about that folder stuck with her. On the label, it said, K-Fin Vinyl. Nothing more. She didn't know what it meant. But something about it, something in her gut, told her it wasn't just junk. And then came the recording. The prosecution played a short audio clip. Just a minute or so. It was from an earlier deposition she gave. In it, she recalled a conversation she overheard between two staffers. One of them had asked the other, "Why is the fireplace always burning even in the summer?" The other staffer's answer? "That's how the truth dies around here." Those words, "That's how the truth dies around here," landed in the courtroom like a bomb. You could hear the air leave people's lungs, like no one dared move. Diddy exhaled, long and slow. Then, for the first time, he buried his face in his hands. Now Diddy's not new to courtrooms. He's faced lawsuits, scandals, tabloid rumors. But this wasn't about headlines or PR damage. This was personal. This was truth trying to claw its way to the surface after being buried for years. One of the jurors, a woman in her 40s with short blonde hair, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The court sketch artist, who up until now had been doodling quietly, suddenly started drawing like her life depended on it. She knew she was watching a moment people would talk about for years. Then the prosecution kept going. They brought up the Maid's history, how she'd worked in the house for over a decade, how she'd never once filed a complaint, never tried to sell her story. The judge nodded along. The jury listened with an intensity I've rarely seen. She wasn't just another employee. She was a witness to what wasn't supposed to be seen. And as her voice steadied, as she began recounting what she remembered in the weeks before Kim Porter's death, you could feel it. This wasn't just testimony anymore. It was the beginning of the unraveling. You ever see something invisible suddenly come into focus? That's what it felt like in that courtroom. One minute it was just the maid on the stand, speaking softly about trash and whispers and things half seen. The next, the entire room seemed to be holding its breath, because the maid's testimony, it unlocked something. The prosecution had been holding on to more, and now they were ready to lay it all out. First came the audio clips. They said these were statements from former staff, people who had worked inside Diddy's home but were too afraid to testify in person. They gave their voices, their memories, under protection. You could see the faces on the jury tighten. You could feel it in the room. This wasn't just about what one person had seen. It was bigger, deeper. The first clip played. A man's voice. Mid-30s, maybe. His voice shook a little, but there was something in it, like he'd been waiting to say this for years. "I used to work events in the East Wing. We weren't allowed phones. That was rule number 1. One time I saw a guest trying to record something down by the den. Security tackled him before he could even lift his hand. We never saw him again. Like, never." No one said anything when the clip ended. The silence itself was loud. Then the second clip. This time, it was a woman. She sounded worn out. Older, maybe. Her words were quiet, but sharp. "I quit after I found an NDA in my pay envelope. One I never signed. I told them I hadn't agreed to anything. Next day I got a call from an unlisted number. A man said I'd ruin my life if I made noise. His exact words were, 'You'll lose more than a job.' I didn't say a word. Until now." Now people were shifting in their seats. Not just the jury. Everyone. Reporters scribbled fast. A few looked like they weren't sure whether to write or just listen. But the biggest shock came next. It wasn't a voice. It was a written statement from a former security contractor. The prosecution read it out loud. Slowly. You could hear the tick of the old wall clock behind the judge. That's how quiet it got. There was a protocol for dealing with guests who got out of line, drunk, emotional, threatening to speak. We were told to take them to room 17. That was the first time we heard it. Room 17. Nobody in the room had heard that name before. Not on floor plans. Not in previous testimonies. Nothing. The contractor continued. Room 17 wasn't on the blueprints. It wasn't in the security logs. It was hidden behind a mirrored wall in the East Wing. Inside, padded walls. One bed, a camera mounted in the corner, and a metal cabinet. Everyone stared at the prosecutor like they'd misread it. The cabinet had folders, dozens, each one labeled. Inside, photos, NDAs, recordings. The kind of stuff that keeps people quiet. We called it leverage. We were told to never speak of it. But it exists. Even the judge sat back in his chair, blinking slowly. He cleared his throat and said the statement wouldn't be considered part of the official record, not until it was verified. But it was. Too late. The courtroom had heard it. And more importantly, the press had heard it. Within minutes of recess, it was online. Room 17 was trending across every platform. People outside the courthouse were holding up phones, playing the clips, reading the statement. And those inside, they weren't just watching a trial anymore. They were watching a reveal. Diddy, up until now, had kept a tight grip, always composed, polished. But now his hand started trembling. He wiped his brow. His suit, custom tailored, probably cost more than a car, was soaked with sweat under the arms. Someone passed him a tissue. He took it, slowly. He wasn't looking at anyone anymore. Not the jury, not his lawyers, not the judge. And that's when you realized something. This wasn't just about evidence. It was about exposure. Not in the legal sense, but in the human sense. Like a spotlight had been turned on, and all the things hiding in the corners were finally being seen. The maid opened the door. But these voices, these clips, this shadowy room 17, that was the moment we all realized. The house had now, by this point, the courtroom wasn't just watching a trial anymore. People were leaning forward, lips tight, not blinking. Even the jurors, those who tried to stay neutral, couldn't help it. They were drawn in, because what came next, it wasn't just about parties or contracts or hidden rooms. It was about Kim. Up until then, no one had said her name directly. There was a kind of respectful silence about her. She was Diddy's ex-partner, the mother of 3 of his children. She had passed away years ago, 2018. Lobar pneumonia, the report said. Tragic, but ordinary. But the prosecution wasn't going to tiptoe around it anymore. They brought her name forward, carefully but deliberately, and what they revealed started connecting dots that had once seemed far apart. They said, "We cannot ignore the link between the witness's testimony and the circumstances surrounding Miss Porter's death." There was a shift in the air, a subtle one, but real. People sat up straighter. Then the maid spoke again. She said in the weeks before Kim's death, something in the house changed. Diddy stopped throwing parties. He was quieter, edgier. The atmosphere was tighter, like a storm was coming. Staff were whispering more. And the trash, her job always routine, started feeling strange. One day, she said, she found something she couldn't forget. A manila folder in the kitchen trash. On the tab, handwritten in marker, KFN vinyl. It meant nothing to her then, just another piece of clutter. But that same day, a voicemail came through the house phone. From Kim. The maid said her voice was shaking, like she was crying or trying not to cry. It was short, barely a few seconds before another staff member came by and deleted it. But one line burned itself into her memory. "They know I'm going to talk. I just don't want to die for it." That line, the way the maid said it, quiet, trembling. It was like she'd been holding it in for years. You could feel the courtroom freeze. Even the defense attorneys stopped shuffling their papers. The judge leaned forward and said calmly, "This information will not be treated as conclusive, but the witness's account will remain part of the record." The defense objected. Of course, they always do. But it was already too late, because in that moment, Kim Porter's death stopped being a distant tragedy. It became a thread in a larger story, and that maid, soft-spoken, tucked in a blazer too big for her shoulders, had just yanked on that thread. She didn't scream. She didn't accuse. She just told what she saw, what she remembered, and what she never forgot. The folder, the voicemail, the change in the house. That was the climax, not in volume or theatrics, but in truth, in that aching, undeniable kind of truth that makes everyone in the room feel small for a second. Because suddenly, this wasn't about what Diddy did or didn't do. It was about what was lost. A woman, a voice, a warning, and a silence that went on too long. You'd think after everything the maid had already said, after the whispers and the burned contracts and that haunting voicemail from Kim, the courtroom had seen enough. But it hadn't. Not quite, because the maid had one more thing to share. She sat forward, a little shakier now, and said, "There's something else." She told the court that after she left Diddy's staff, quietly, without a fuss, she took one sealed bag with her. She hadn't dared open it since, didn't know if she ever would, but she couldn't throw it away either. Something inside told her, "Keep it. You might need it someday." She'd kept it hidden in a storage unit, paid for in cash. No names, no trail, just fear and memory holding it in place. And now, she had brought it in. The bailiff stepped forward and took the bag gently from her. It was clear plastic, sealed, old, but carefully preserved. Inside, bits and pieces, broken things, but each one had weight. Burned Polaroids, some faces blurred by flame, others partially intact. Memory cards, warped at the edges like they'd been near heat, and handwritten notes. Names, dates. Some names the courtroom recognized, some it didn't. I didn't understand what it meant at the time, she said, barely above a whisper. But now I know. It was insurance. For someone. The prosecution requested it be entered into evidence. Under strict protection. No leaks. No public display. The judge, after a long pause, gave a slow nod. And then, something shifted. You could feel it. Even before anything happened. Diddy stood up. No announcement. No outburst. He just stood, silent, still, like someone whose shadow had finally caught up with them. He leaned toward one of his attorneys and whispered something we couldn't hear. Then, without a single word to the judge, jury, or courtroom, he walked out. No dramatics, no press statement. Just turned and left through the side door like someone who just realized this wasn't a performance anymore. People started murmuring. The judge called for an emergency recess. Reporters outside scrambled to get the story out. Some said Diddy had collapsed in the hallway. Others whispered about a breakdown. Some claimed he'd been flagged as a flight risk. But inside that courtroom, we were all just still. His seat stayed empty for over 2 hours. And when the court resumed, it was still empty. And that's when it hit everyone. This quiet maid, the woman no one had noticed before, the one who cleaned the floors, changed the sheets, and took out the trash. She had changed everything, with a bag of secrets and a voice that refused to be silenced. Because sometimes, truth doesn't come charging in with flashing lights or loud accusations. Sometimes it comes in with trembling hands, a garbage bag, and the courage to say, I saw it, I remember. And when that truth finally lands, even the mighty